Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel Kennedy, has died at the age of 96. Her grandson, Joe Kennedy III, announced the news on social media.
The tragedy of Ethel Kennedy just keeps getting sadder. And the deeper you go into her life, the harder it becomes to believe that one person could endure this much pain and still remain standing. First, she lost her parents in a sudden, devastating plane crash. Then years later, she watched her husband get shot right in front of her. Most people would never recover from something like that. But for Ethel, that was only the beginning. Because the heartbreak didn't stop there. Two of her sons would die in completely different but equally tragic ways. A grandson would be taken too soon. A granddaughter would lose her life to addiction. And even in her final years, when life should have been quiet and peaceful, she faced something she may have never expected. A deep and painful divide within her own family. By the end of her life, many believe the so-called curse surrounding her family wasn't just a story anymore, it was real. And somehow it had followed her through every stage of her life. But before all of that darkness, Ethel's story began in a world filled with light, privilege, and opportunity. She was born into wealth, but it wasn't the kind that had existed for generations. Her father had built it from nothing. Starting with almost no money, working long hours for very little pay, he eventually found a business idea that changed everything. He saw value in something others ignored and turned it into a fortune. By the time Ethel was a child, her family was living a life of incredible comfort. Their home was massive, almost overwhelming in size. Dozens of rooms, sprawling grounds, and a constant sense of activity. But what really made her childhood unique wasn't the wealth. It was the energy. Her home was loud, wild, full of life. There were children everywhere, constant movement, laughter, and chaos that never really stopped. It wasn't a quiet, controlled environment. It was unpredictable, and in many ways, it shaped who she would become. Ethel grew up fearless. She wasn't the kind of person who tried to blend in or follow strict expectations. She was bold, outgoing, and naturally drawn to people. While others focused on being perfect, she focused on being present, enjoying life, connecting with others, and living in the moment. But there was another side to her upbringing that would become incredibly important later in her life: faith. Her mother was deeply devoted, and that belief system became a foundation for Ethel as well. At the time, it may have seemed like just another part of her upbringing, but years later, it would become the one thing she could rely on when everything else began to fall apart. As she grew older, her life followed a fairly typical path for someone of her background. Good schools, social events, and a growing circle of friends. She wasn't necessarily known for academic excellence, but that didn't matter. What made her stand out was her presence. People were drawn to her energy, her honesty, and her ability to make any situation feel alive. And then during a trip in her teenage years, something happened that would quietly change her life forever. She met the family that would define her future. At first, it didn't seem like anything significant. Just another introduction, another connection through friends. But over time, that connection grew stronger. Eventually, she found herself drawn to a young man who shared her passion, her intensity, and her sense of purpose. Their relationship didn't begin in a straightforward way. In fact, at one point, he had been involved with someone else close to her. But life has a way of shifting things, and in time, the two of them found their way to each other. When they married, it was a moment filled with excitement, celebration, and hope. It felt like the beginning of something powerful, and in many ways, it was. Their life together quickly became intertwined with politics, influence, and a level of public attention that few people ever experience. But Ethel didn't shy away from it. She embraced it. She wasn't content to stand quietly on the sidelines. She became deeply involved, campaigning, organizing, speaking, and connecting with people in a way that felt genuine and real. Even while raising a growing family, even while dealing with the pressures of public life, she stayed active and engaged. From the outside, everything looked almost perfect. A strong marriage, a beautiful family, a life filled with purpose. But then, everything changed. The first major crack came suddenly and without warning. Her parents were killed in a plane crash. There was no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, just loss, immediate and overwhelming. At the time, she was pregnant. Despite the grief, she didn't stop. She couldn't. She continued to care for her family, support her husband, and move forward as if nothing had happened. But something inside her had shifted. It was the first time she experienced that kind of deep, personal loss. And it wouldn't be the last. In the years that followed, her life became even more intense. Political campaigns, global events, and moments that would shape history itself. She found herself at the center of it all, not just as a witness, but as an active participant. She balanced it all with an almost unbelievable level of energy. But then came the moment that would change everything again. A phone call. Short, direct, devastating. The news that someone she loved had been shot. The world around her seemed to stop. For a moment, everything felt unreal. But even in that moment, she stayed strong. She had to. There were children to think about, a family to hold together, a future that still needed to be faced, no matter how painful it had become. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't possibly get worse, they did. Another shooting, another loss. This time it was even closer. More personal. She was there. She saw it happen. In an instant, the life she had built was shattered in a way that words can barely describe. And yet, she didn't collapse. She didn't break down in public. She didn't allow herself to fall apart, at least not where anyone could see. Instead, she became something else, a symbol of strength. People looked at her and couldn't understand how she was still standing, how she was still composed, how she was still able to function after witnessing something so traumatic. But strength doesn't mean the pain isn't there. It just means you keep going anyway. And Ethel kept going. She poured her energy into causes, into helping others, into continuing the work that had meant so much to her family. She refused to let tragedy define her completely. But no matter how much she gave to the world, the losses kept coming. Years later, she would face another kind of heartbreak, the loss of a child. It's something no parent is ever prepared for, something that feels fundamentally wrong, no matter how it happens. Her son had been struggling for years. There were signs, warnings, moments where things could have gone differently. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He was gone. And just as she began to process that grief, another tragedy struck. Another son. A sudden, violent accident that took him away without warning. It was almost impossible to comprehend. 2 children. Gone. The weight of that kind of loss is something most people would never survive emotionally. But somehow, she endured. Not because it was easy, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had no other choice. Over time, the tragedies extended beyond her immediate children. They reached into the next generation. A grandson lost in a sudden accident, a granddaughter taken by addiction, each loss adding another layer of grief, another reminder that the pain wasn't over. People began to talk, to wonder how one family could experience so much tragedy, to question whether it was just coincidence or something more. But for Ethel, it wasn't about theories or explanations. It was personal. Each loss was a name, a face, a memory. And through it all, she remained steady. She rarely spoke openly about her pain. When she did, it was quiet, controlled, almost as if she had learned to carry it in a way that didn't require words. Instead, she turned to her faith. It became her anchor. In moments where nothing else made sense, it gave her something to hold on to, something that helped her keep moving forward, even when the weight of everything felt unbearable. As the years passed, she grew older. The world around her changed. The intensity of her earlier life faded into something quieter, but the pain never fully disappeared. And then, in her later years, something unexpected happened. The conflict didn't come from outside tragedy. It came from within her own family. differences that became public, decisions that created distance, moments that revealed cracks in what had once seemed unbreakable. For someone who had spent her life holding everything together, this may have been one of the hardest things to face. Because this time, it wasn't something she could fight or fix. It was something she had to live with. And then her health began to decline. After everything she had endured, her body finally started to slow down. A stroke. Sudden, quiet, final. In many ways, it felt like the end of a long, exhausting journey. A life that had been filled with both incredible highs and unimaginable lows. Days later, she passed away. She was in her 90s. A long life by any standard. But when people looked back, they didn't just see the years. They saw the resilience, the strength, the way she carried herself through moments that would have completely destroyed most people. Ethel Kennedy didn't just experience tragedy. She lived through it over and over again. And somehow, she never let it completely break her. That's what makes her story so powerful. Not just the pain, but the endurance. Not just the loss, but the way she kept going. Because in the end, her life wasn't defined only by what she lost,